When I moved to America in 2011, one of the biggest editing struggles I had was trying to get my head around all of the different frame rate options they seem to have here. Am I supposed to work in 24 frames a second, or 30, or am I supposed to use one of these weird fractional frame rates? What does non-drop frame mean? What if I want to add slow motion or super high-speed footage to my edit? In this video, I'm going to show you everything that I've learned in the last 15 years about frame rates, and then we're going to jump into Resolve, and we'll look at all of the settings that you need to know and the problems you might run into. Now, here's an example of why I was so confused. The little Sony camera I'm filming on right now gives me two options for frame rate, 24 frames a second or 30. But when I import files from that camera into Resolve, the files it creates are actually 23.976 frames a second or 29.97. Now, some camera companies label their settings as 24 or 30 purely because the screen is too small to actually fit the decimals. But before we jump into Resolve and start dealing with a bunch of frame rate headaches, I actually want to take a minute to talk about why all of these fractional frame rates even exist in the first place. See, it's actually all down to a bunch of technical compromises that began about 100 years ago. You see, in the beginning, we had two simple numbers. Movies ran at 24 frames a second, and television, here in the US, ran at 30. It's a little bit different in other parts of the world, but we're going to get to that in a second. Now, let's begin with movies and hop back in time to the 1920s. From the invention of motion pictures in the late 1800s up until the 1920s, these early silent films ran at all sorts of speeds, anywhere from 16 to 26 frames a second. With early cameras, you had to literally hand crank the film through the camera, so that meant you had really inconsistent speeds. Also, film was pretty fragile, so using a slower frame rate meant it had less chance of snapping in the middle of a shoot. Of course, capitalism being what it is, some theatre owners realised that if they projected a film at faster speeds to make the whole film finish quicker, they could squeeze in extra screenings and sell more tickets in a day. But when Warner Brothers released The Jazz Singer in 1927, this was one of the first films that had the sound of the actor talking and singing on screen.
Wait a minute, you ain't heard nothing yet.
So they needed to make sure that the sound stayed perfectly synchronized with the picture. And that meant that they had to standardize the frame rate. Now, at the time, movie theaters were averaging between 22 to 26 frames a second, so they chose 24 frames as a compromise. That also had the benefit of being fast enough for the human eye to perceive it as continuous motion instead of just a series of still images played one after another. Television was a different situation. Back in the early 1940s, US television was broadcasting a standard called NTSC, which stands for the National Television System Committee, and that standard broadcast at 30 frames a second. Now, why 30? Because that's what matched the mains frequency of the power grid, which in the US is 60 Hz. By synchronizing TV refresh rates with the power frequency that country was using, engineers were able to avoid weird interference patterns that were showing up on screen. Now that's the reason why in parts of the world like Europe that use a 50 Hz frequency, television is broadcast at 25 frames a second. Now, if you're new to working in broadcast TV, you're going to have to learn about the concept of interlaced video. Now that's honestly worth a whole video of its own, but very basically, with an interlaced video, each frame is split into two fields or rows of pixels. One has all the even rows and one has all the odd rows, and then they're played one after the other. By splitting the frame in half, you lowered the bandwidth needed to send the signal out, which made it easier to broadcast. And it also helped with the TV technology at the time. You see, TVs weren't always as skinny as they are today. I started working as an editor back in 2004, and back then, my reference monitors were these big fat CRT or cathode ray tube monitors. These monitors used a phosphor-coated screen. An electron beam would sweep across the screen from left to right, line by line, top to bottom. When the beam hit the phosphor coating, it would glow, but only briefly, and then it would start to fade, which created a big challenge. You needed to refresh the image quickly enough that the viewers wouldn't see a bunch of flickering. And here's where interlacing saves the day. Instead of drawing all of the lines sequentially in one pass, the system would draw the first field of odd-numbered lines, and then the second field of even-numbered lines, and each field took 1/60th of a second. This way, the phosphor was still glowing from the first field when you started to draw the second one a 60th of a second later. And to the human eye, this created the perception of a complete image being refreshed 60 times a second, even though you were only transmitting half the vertical resolution in each field. So if you see a video file called something like 60i or 50i, just know that those are 30 or 25 frame a second videos that have been interlaced. Anyway, let's fast forward to the 1950s. Color TV is coming, and engineers face a massive challenge. It's not like everybody with a black and white TV suddenly went out and bought a color one. So how do you add color information to the existing black and white signal without breaking everybody's TV? The solution was brilliant, but weird. They slightly slowed down the frame rate by a factor of 1,000 over 1,001, creating just enough space in the signal to squeeze in the color information. And that meant that 30 frames a second was slowed down to become 29.97 frames a second. This wasn't a thing in the 50Hz countries when they made the switch to color. See, European engineers had watched the US struggle with the technical flaws of their NTSC system for years, and then they used that knowledge to build a more stable system called PAL, or Phase Alternating Line, in the 1960s. Now, I'm not going to go into all the weird maths behind it because I don't really understand it all, but just know that everything in the land of PAL was 25 frames a second before, and it still is today. Alright, remember those 24 frame a second movies? Now, when they need to be broadcast on TV, that means they've got to be converted to match the 30 frames a second standard. If you just play a 24 frame a second film at 30 frames instead, then the movie will finish 20% faster and everyone's going to sound like chipmunks.
Can't do anything to fix this. Wait, maybe we can fix it.
They fix this problem by creating something called a 3-2 pulldown. If you split the frames of a film into two fields, that will give you 48 fields a second. The 30 frames a second of a TV broadcast gives us 60 fields a second. So to broadcast a film on TV, we need to turn 48 fields into 60 fields. Now to do this, we have to invent 12 extra fields every second. The way the 3-2 pattern works, instead of giving every film frame 2 fields, the process will alternate. The first frame gets 3 fields, the next one gets 2, and so on back and forth. Over a full second, that means 24 frames get stretched out to fill the 60 fields or 30 frames. Alright, still with me? Good. Now, when they slowed down the broadcast frame rate for that switch to color TV, movies then had to go through the same slowdown process. And that's what led to 24 frames a second becoming 23.976, because that's 24 multiplied by 1000 over 1001. And because of all of this weird maths, there's now another issue that we've got to deal with. Since you're broadcasting videos at 29.97 frames a second instead of an even 30, that means that over time, the timecode is going to slowly drift away from the actual time on your watch. Now, this is where we have to introduce the idea of drop frame and non-drop frame timecode. If you work in non-drop frame, the timecode counts every single frame sequentially. 0, 1, 2, up to 29, then it rolls over to the next second. It assumes that the video is running at exactly 30 frames a second. The problem is that since the video is actually 0.1% slower, the timecode clock falls behind the real-world time. So if you press play on something for exactly an hour, a real-world clock would show that an hour had passed, but a non-drop frame timecode clock would show 59 minutes, 56 seconds, and 12 frames. That's a little over 3.5 seconds of drift. That's where drop frame comes in. Drop frame is sort of a smart timecode that's going to periodically skip timecode numbers to stay perfectly synced with timecode in the real world. Now, despite the name, drop frame does not drop actual visual frames. Every frame still plays. It just skips some of the numbers given to those frames. So what you see is the timecode clock skipping 2 frame numbers every minute, except for every 10th minute. So for example, you're going to see the timer jump from 59 seconds and 29 frames to 1 minute and 2 frames. It just skips the numbers for frame 0 and frame 1. Again, it's not skipping actual frames of video. It's just skipping the numbers. Now you can tell if you're looking at video in drop frame because on the timecode clock, the frames bit at the end is going to be separated with a semicolon or a period instead of a colon like the rest of the numbers. Now one other thing. Drop frame isn't something that you see as an option for 23.976 footage. That's because it's not actually a broadcast format. If it was going to get broadcast, it would be converted into 29.97. If you're finding all of this really confusing, I am right there with you. And you might also be thinking, that's ancient history. Everything is digital now, so why are we still using these weird fractional numbers? Well, it all comes down to backwards compatibility. Decades of content, broadcast equipment, and broadcast standards have all been built around these frame rates. So changing them now would be like trying to change the US to the metric system. Technically, way better, but practically kind of impossible. So next time you're working on a video and you see a fractional frame rate, just remember you're looking at the ghost of a 1950s engineering hack that solved the color TV crisis and somehow never left us. It's a really annoying example of how temporary solutions in technology have this weird way of becoming permanent standards. Now, with all of that out of the way, let's take a look at Resolve and the settings that you need to know. Every time you start a new project, in the project settings, you need to be aware of the frame rate you've chosen, because once you start adding footage to timelines, that gets locked in. There are some workarounds for changing it once you've started, and I've showed those off in a previous video that I'll link to down below. But life will be significantly easier if you set that correctly from the start. When it comes to choosing what frame rate to work in, it really comes down to 2 questions. What frame rate was it filmed in? And where is it going to be watched? And for all of these YouTube videos that I've been making, I've got the project set to 23.976 because that's what this camera is giving me. If you're making something that's primarily going to be watched on TV, I would probably film and edit at 29.97 in countries where that's the standard, or in 25 frames a second in places like Europe. Even if at some later date it's also going to end up online on something like YouTube, they accept pretty much any frame rate, so you're not going to have any trouble uploading that. Now I want to talk about what happens to your footage when you add it to a timeline that's got a different frame rate. Let's start with footage that's got more frames than the timeline. In this example, the timeline is set to 24 frames a second, but the footage is 60 frames a second. I'm going to select a 5-second portion using I and O to mark in and out points. Now when I add that footage to the timeline, by default, Resolve is going to automatically retime the media to accommodate the timeline frame rate. This means that the clip will play back its original real-time speed, so it will still last 5 seconds on the timeline, despite the lower frame rate of the sequence. But to do that, Resolve has to skip some frames. At this point, we have to talk about the setting that controls how Resolve decides what to do about this difference between the frames of the footage and the timeline. This is called the Retime Process. Now, there are 3 different ones, and we're going to look at them all in a second, but the default is called Nearest. Resolve looks at the timeline's 24 frames a second cadence, and then it selects specific frames from that original 60 frames per second source that are mathematically closest or nearest to those points in time, and then it just throws away the extra frames in between. In this example, it's going from 60 frames per second to 24. So that means there are 2.5 frames of footage for every frame available on the timeline. And so Resolve will want to show every 2.5 source frames. And since it can't show half a frame, it's going to alternate between dropping 2 and 3 frames to stay in sync. Let's swap it around. This timeline is 60 frames a second, and the footage we're adding is 24 frames a second. So since the timeline needs more frames than the footage is providing to play back in real time, and our default retime process is Nearest, it's just going to repeat frames to fill in the gaps. So if I step through frame by frame, you'll see the frames repeating. Now, obviously, that looks a bit crap and stuttery. And depending on the footage, if you've got a high frame rate shot on a lower frame rate timeline, that can look a little bit weird too. So if you want to try one of the other retime processes and see if you can get some better results, there are 2 places where you can make that change. If you go to the project settings by hitting Shift and 9 on your keyboard or clicking that cog icon in the bottom right of the UI, then go to Master Settings and then scroll to the bottom and you'll find the Frame Interpolation section. Under there, you can change the default retime process from Nearest to one of the other 2 options, which are Frame Blend and Optical Flow. Saying that, I wouldn't actually make that change here. These other 2 options, and Optical Flow in particular, can be more taxing on your machine, and since you might not want or need those for every shot, I'd rather pick one of these alternatives on a shot-by-shot basis instead of changing the default. So to do that, with the clip selected on your timeline, head to the inspector. If you don't already have the panel open, just click the inspector button or hit Command 9 on your keyboard. Down at the bottom, you'll find the Retime and Scaling section. Under Retime Process, your options are using whatever was chosen in the project settings or picking from one of the 3 options. Now, we've already covered Nearest. Frame Blend dissolves adjacent frames together to try and make the shot look smoother. Optical Flow uses something called motion estimation to create entirely new in-between frames. If you select that option, under motion estimation, you're going to find lots of different options. Basically, the lower down on that list you go, the higher the quality, but the harder it is for your machine to play back in real time without caching or using render in place. With all that said, definitely start with the less powerful options first, because depending on the shot, there's a very good chance you're going to get more than usable results without having to strangle your machine. Also, I do want to head back to the project settings quickly because I've got to point something out. There is a section just related to optical flow, although they don't make a good job of making that clear, called motion range. What it's doing is telling Optical Flow's motion estimation algorithm how much movement to expect between frames, so it can sort of calibrate its analysis of the shot accordingly. The 3 options are small, medium, and large, and that corresponds to the scale of motion in the source material. Small is for slow, subtle movement. It tells the algorithm to be sensitive to small moves across the frame. Medium is a middle ground default, and large is for fast action or camera movement with loads of motion blur across a wider area of the frame. If Optical Flow is producing artifacts on your shot, this setting is sometimes part of the reason. Fast-moving shots analyzed with this set to small is going to confuse the algorithm because the actual motion is exceeding what it's expecting. And on the other end of the scale, using large on a slow, detailed shot can cause the algorithm to miss subtle motion entirely. But here's the weird thing. In the Resolve manual, when I look at the project settings section, it says this setting can also be changed on a clip-by-clip basis in the edit page. But as far as I can tell, it can't. There is no motion range section in the inspector. So I guess that means that motion range is something that you can only change on a project level. And that means that this is either a mistake in the manual, or the feature was planned but it was never implemented, or it used to be there but it was removed at some point and that bit of the manual just wasn't updated. So in any case, if you're having issues, you can try changing this setting, but just know that that's going to change every shot that you've applied optical flow to in your project. Now, there's one issue that I want to touch on very briefly that sounds like a total nightmare on paper, and that's mismatched frame rates for footage that's supposed to be in sync. So let's say you shot an interview with two cameras. Camera A filmed at 24 frames a second just like you wanted, but camera B lied to you like my Sony camera does, and actually shot at 23.976. And if, like me, you've been editing for a couple of decades, you'd be getting ready to scream at somebody right now, because back in the days of Final Cut Pro 7 or on early versions of Avid, mixing those two frame rates would have caused the sync to drift over time. So after 10 minutes, you'd be a little over half a second out of sync, and after an hour, that would have drifted to about 3.5 seconds out of sync. Because software back then played footage back frame for frame, which means they were actually speeding up the slower footage. And then you would lose your mind trying to cut and nudge it back into place as that drift got worse and worse over time. Now if you drop them onto a timeline, Resolve is actually smart enough to keep them in real-time sync so the audio doesn't drift. But it does this by secretly duplicating a frame every now and then to force that slower clip to keep up. Now, I'm going to put some maths on screen, so if you've got any trouble sleeping, you can give all of that a read. But what it's showing us is that every 1001 frames, a 23.976 clip on a 24 frame a second timeline falls behind by exactly one frame. So to maintain real-time sync, Resolve will repeat a frame at that exact cadence. If the shot's got a lot of motion, you're going to notice a tiny little micro-stutter where that frame gets repeated. But if it's a talking head interview, chances are you're never going to notice. So just be grateful that you live in the present, because this used to be a giant pain in the ass. But what do you do if you've got some high frame rate footage and you actually want to play it in slow motion? There are a couple of different ways of dealing with this, so let's go through them one by one. In this example, I've got a 24 frame a second timeline, and I've got this footage that's shot at 50 frames a second. As we've already covered, if I just add it to the timeline, it's going to play back in real time and just discard the extra frames. If you want to play back every frame that was filmed so it plays in slow motion, there are two main methods. The first one is to reinterpret the footage so Resolve plays it at a different frame rate. If you select it, right-click and select Clip Attributes, then under the Video tab, go to the Video Frame Rate option. If you change that to match the timeline, that will now play back every single frame and change the duration of the clip in the process. Now, it's important to know that if you do this, it will affect any instance of that clip that's already in the timeline of your project. In this example, I'm going to add the whole clip to the timeline at the original frame rate, so it's playing back in real time. I'll park my playhead on a frame, then in the media pool, I'll reinterpret the footage. Did you see that frame change? Even though I already made the edit, Resolve is respecting the new frame rate and altering how that clip is being interpreted. This even happens if you do it to the clip on the timeline. I'll click undo with Command Z to reset the clip. On the timeline, I'm going to right-click and select Clip Attributes to confirm it's back to normal. Now I'm going to duplicate this clip by selecting it and holding down Alt on the keyboard while I drag it. On this second instance, I'll right-click, select Clip Attributes, and change it to match my timeline. I can now drag it out longer because it's slowed down. But now look at the first clip, because that's been slowed down too. And if I go to Clip Attributes, I can see that this has indeed been changed. And here's a weird bug. If I go back into the Clip Attributes and change it back, the whole clip goes offline. But if I instead hit Command Z to undo, that resets it. Oh, and before I forget, if you're going to use this method of reinterpreting the footage, but you're also planning on using a proxy workflow, make sure that you create your proxies before you start messing with the clip attributes, because that can lead to a world of hurt if you try and do it after the fact, and it's bit me on the arse more than once, so please learn from my mistakes. And if you don't know what proxy files are or why you would use them, I made a video all about them and I'll link to that in the description. So this method works well if you know you're going to be consistent with the speed that you want. But what if you want to play portions of the clip at different speeds? You can duplicate the clip in the media pool and then reinterpret that duplicate. That way, you've got one with the original frame rate and another instance with your new one, and they don't affect each other. But working with duplicates can get messy and confusing, so the other way is to use the clip speed or retime controls, but that's not without its own level of confusion. Right-click on the clip and select Change Clip Speed, or just hit R on the keyboard with the clip selected. Now here's the first weird thing. Look at the frames per second section. That's not showing the frame rate of the clip as you would expect. Instead, it's showing you the timeline frame rate. So if you want to play back every frame, you're going to have to do some maths. The timeline is 24 frames a second, and the footage is 50. Divide 24 by 50, and you get 0.48. That means you'll want to change the clip speed to 48%. But notice that while it's playing at the slowed down speed, the duration of the clip on the timeline hasn't changed. If you wanted the whole segment of the clip that you'd added to your timeline to show up, you can either drag out the end of the clip to show all the frames you want, or when you're making the speed change, make sure Ripple Timeline is checked. That might mess up clips later in your timeline though, so be careful if you use that function. One other method is to use the retime control rather than the speed change one. Select your clip and either hit Command-R on the keyboard or right-click and select Retime Controls. Now if you grab the top corner of the clip, you can change the speed. Just be warned that the percentage number does round up and down. So if I try to eyeball 48%, and then I select the clip and bring up the speed controls, you'll see I'm not exactly on the money. So you can rough it in by dragging out the retime control, and then you can use this speed control to get your speed to exactly where you want it. All right, I know that was a lot, but if you found it helpful, please take a second to hit the like button because it really does help other people find these videos. And make sure you subscribe so you don't miss out on more Resolve tips and tricks like these. Thank you so much for watching. I will see you in the next one.